Picture this. I'm firing up my BBQ at my serene lake cabin, the smell of burgers sizzling when out of nowhere, an HOA Karen storms in, screaming about rules, and dials 911 right in front of me. But in just 3 minutes, I turned the tables and got her entire HOA evicted for good. Stick around to hear how this wild showdown unfolded. If you love insane HOA drama, crazy neighbor battles, and jaw-dropping twists, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss a single story. Let's dive into this wild tale at my lake cabin. The sun dipped low over the glassy surface of Lake Serenity, casting a warm golden hue across the water. At my modest cabin, nestled among towering pines, the air was thick with the scent of charcoal and sizzling meat. I'd been coming to this cabin for years, a quiet retreat from the city's chaos where I could grill, fish, and breathe without a soul telling me how to live. The cabin sat on a small plot of land, technically within the boundaries of the Lake Serenity Homeowners Association, but my family had owned it long before the HOA even existed. We were grandfathered in, exempt from their petty rules, or so I thought. As I flipped burgers on the grill, the peace was shattered by the crunch of gravel under tires. A sleek black SUV screeched to a halt and out stepped a woman whose presence screamed trouble. She was middle-aged with a severe bob haircut and a clipboard clutched like a weapon. This was Karen, though I didn't know her name yet, the self-appointed enforcer of the HOA's iron grip. She marched toward me, her lips pursed, eyes narrowed, radiating the kind of righteous fury that could only come from someone who lived to control others. She didn't introduce herself, didn't wave, just launched into a tirade about the smoke from my grill, claiming it violated some obscure HOA regulation about nuisance odors. I stood there, tongs in hand, watching her gesticulate wildly, her voice rising with every word. The audacity was staggering. She was on my property, yelling about rules I'd never agreed to. I tried to stay calm, explaining my grandfathered status, but she wasn't listening. Her face turned redder, her clipboard shaking as she scribbled something furiously. Then, without warning, she pulled out her phone and dialed 911, claiming I was creating a public disturbance and endangering the community with my unauthorized fire. I couldn't believe it. A BBQ, a few burgers, and this woman was calling the cops? The absurdity of it all made me laugh, which only fueled her rage. As she ranted into the phone, I noticed neighbors peeking from their windows, drawn by the commotion. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was a spectacle. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let this slide. Karen thought she had the upper hand, but she didn't know who she was dealing with. I'd spent years navigating legal loopholes for my small business, and I had a knack for sniffing out weak spots. Something about her overconfidence, her absolute certainty in her HOA's authority, told me there was a crack in their system waiting to be exposed. As the distant wail of sirens grew closer, I grabbed my phone and started recording, capturing every second of her meltdown. The police arrived, 2 officers stepping out with weary expressions clearly used to HOA nonsense. Karen launched into her complaints, pointing at the grill like it was a crime scene. I stayed calm, showed the officers my property deed, and explained my exempt status. They nodded, unimpressed with Karen's theatrics, and told her to take it up with the HOA board. She stormed off, vowing to make me regret this, but I was already formulating a plan. The HOA had overstepped, and I was going to dig into their rules, their records, anything that could turn this petty power trip against them. As the sun set, I sat on my porch, the grill cooling beside me, and started researching. The HOA's website was a mess of vague bylaws and outdated notices, but one thing stood out. Their claim to authority over my land seemed shaky at best. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning I woke with a fire in my belly. Not from the BBQ, but from a growing suspicion that the HOA's grip on Lake Serenity was built on sand. Karen's stunt had lit a fuse, and I was determined to see how far it would burn. I drove to the county records office, a dusty building staffed by clerks who seemed half asleep. Armed with my property deed and a hunch, I requested every document related to the Lake Serenity HOA. What I found was a goldmine of incompetence. The HOA had been formed decades ago, but their filings were a mess, missing signatures, incomplete surveys, and a boundary map that conveniently ignored my family's plot. My cabin, it turned out, was never properly annexed into their jurisdiction, a fact they'd either overlooked or deliberately ignored. This was big, but I needed more. I spent hours poring over the HOA's bylaws, downloaded from their poorly designed website. The rules were a labyrinth of contradictions with clauses about community standards that were so vague they could mean anything. But buried in the fine print was a bombshell. The HOA's board was required to hold public elections every 3 years, yet their current leadership had been in place for over a decade. No elections, no accountability, just a clique of busybodies like Karen ruling by fiat. I couldn't believe they'd been getting away with this. Emboldened, I started talking to neighbors, discreetly at first. Many were fed up with the HOA's overreach. Fines for unapproved mailboxes, warnings for leaving kayaks on docks too long. One older man, Tom, told me how Karen had once threatened to fine him for planting wildflowers, claiming they disrupted the aesthetic. The more I learned, the clearer it became. The HOA wasn't just annoying, it was a rogue operation. Bullying residents into compliance without legitimate authority. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, scheduled for that evening at the community center. The room was packed with tense residents, most too intimidated to speak up. Karen presided like a queen, her clipboard now a gavel as she rattled off new rules about deck furniture. I raised my hand and asked about the election clause. The room went silent. Karen's face twitched and she stammered something about ongoing discussions. I pressed harder, citing the bylaw and the lack of elections. Other residents chimed in, emboldened by my questions. The meeting spiraled into chaos as Karen tried to shut it down, but the damage was done. I'd planted a seed of doubt. That night I dug deeper, finding old HOA financial records online. They were a mess. Unexplained expenses, payments to companies with no clear purpose. One name kept popping up, Serenity Solutions, a vague consulting firm tied to Karen's husband. This wasn't just incompetence. It was corruption. I knew I had to act fast before Karen and her cronies could cover their tracks. The HOA's next move would likely be retaliation, and I needed to be ready. As I sat at my cabin, the lake reflecting the moonlight, I started drafting a letter to the state's attorney general, outlining every violation I'd uncovered. This was no longer about a BBQ, it was about dismantling a miniature dictatorship. The days following the HOA meeting were a whirlwind of strategy and secrecy. I'd stirred the hornet's nest and Karen wasn't going down without a fight. Notices started appearing on neighbors' doors, warning of compliance checks and hinting at legal action against troublemakers. My mailbox was stuffed with a cease and desist letter, accusing me of defamation for questioning the HOA's legitimacy. It was laughable, unsigned on plain paper, clearly a bluff. But it confirmed my suspicions. They were scared. I doubled down, reaching out to a lawyer friend who specialized in property disputes. She was thrilled by the case, calling it a textbook HOA overreach. Together we compiled a dossier. The faulty annexation, the missing elections, the shady financials tied to Serenity Solutions. We filed a formal complaint with the Attorney General and sent copies to every resident in Lake Serenity. The response was immediate. Neighbors started calling, sharing their own stories of harassment. A woman named Linda revealed that Karen had once fined her for a bird feeder, claiming it attracted vermin. Another resident, Mike, said he'd been pressured into paying for landscaping improvements that never materialized. The community was waking up and Karen's empire was crumbling. At the next HOA meeting, the tension was palpable. Karen tried to maintain control, but half the room was openly hostile. I stood up, presenting our findings. The HOA's legal standing was questionable, their elections were non-existent, and their finances were a potential fraud. Residents gasped as I revealed Serenity Solutions' connection to Karen's husband. She tried to interrupt, but the crowd shouted her down. For the first time, she looked small, her clipboard useless. The meeting ended with a vote to dissolve the HOA, proposed by Tom and seconded by Linda. It passed overwhelmingly. Karen stormed out, threatening lawsuits, but the Attorney General's office was already investigating. Within days, they froze the HOA's accounts and issued a cease and desist order of their own. The final blow came when the county invalidated the HOA's charter, citing the improper annexation of my property and others. By week's end, the HOA was dissolved, its board barred from reforming. Karen's SUV was gone from the lake, her cabin listed for sale. As I fired up my BBQ that weekend, the lake felt freer, the air lighter. Neighbors waved, no longer afraid of fines or clipboards. The battle was over and I'd won, not just for me but for everyone. As the sun set, I smiled, knowing Lake Serenity was finally serene. If you enjoyed this wild HOA takedown, smash that like button, subscribe, and share your own crazy neighbor stories in the comments. Hit the bell so you never miss another epic showdown. See you in the next one.